a former marketing director and a fellow Swede, Johan Lindberg. So I think I got that one
You got
right.
the Lindeberg, I think it is.
Yeah.
Say that
That's why I
again,
said
because I think you
Lindberg.
said Lindberg.
I did say Lindberg.
Is it not Lindeberg?
Oh, is it Lindeberg?
I don't know. Say it
Okay,
both
I'll say
ways.
that again.
Yeah.
I'll say.
Say it both ways in case.
This is fun,
I
man.
know.
I'm like,
Johan L.
if I ever try to visit Sweden, they'll be like, someone in the country listen to you talk about
Yeah,
it.
you're not
We're
allowed
fine
in.
with you not.
I'm glad
you
you're
can
getting the Swedish names.
You can butcher all of our proper names.
That's right.
From someplace else. Enjoy Finland. Hey everyone, it's Elliot.
And Todd, welcome to Two Designers Walk Into a Bar, an ongoing conversation about pop culture and iconic design.
In our new season, we're stepping back in time and into a neighborhood watering hole to rub elbows with Gen X as they're coming of age, drinking age.
We could be lounging at a dive in Seattle or maybe checking in at a combo bar/cyber cafe down the coast in San Francisco.
Wherever we find ourselves, we'll be here until the band starts passing the hat or we're kicked out for freeloading.
So ask the bartender for a slightly cool Olympia and see if they have any slightly warm pizza rolls.
And pull up a seat between us and the flannel-clad regulars here in the bar. All right, Todd, so here we are. We're back in the bar. And
We are.
we're still talking Gen X. This is our series on Gen X. And in our last episode, we talked about the cultural landscape that you and I and all the other Gen Xers were coming of age in, right?
Yeah, we did, and you gave us a real good lay of the land and kind of what was leading up to that. And the thing that stuck with me was the bookends, the Berlin Wall coming down on one end and September 11th on the other end, and that really kind of defines the life of a Gen Xer at that time. There were big movements that were happening and big shifts, not only in culture and politics and everything.
Yeah, so of course that landscape also shaped some of the traits in
Yeah.
people who are our age, right? So just a couple of those things to quickly review. This is really when the DIY and indie movements took off with art and music. And as a result of that, people were fairly creative and resourceful. They were able to do a lot with a little. Technology, of course, was really just starting to come into its own. We had super baby internet, as we talked about. And related to that, personal tech was starting to become a thing. You know, a computer was something that you had in your home as well as maybe in your office or at school or whatever.
Would my Walkman be considered personal tech?
Yes, but
Because, you can't rollerblade without your Walkman.
True, yeah. And that I think if anything, rollerblading was probably the downfall of Generation X. Don't you think?
See, are you being a little bit cynical now about the joys of rollerblading?
I'm being ironic and detached, Todd, not necessarily cynical.
Spoken like a real Gen Xer.
Yeah, but there was some cynicism, right? In a lot of ways, not nihilism, but in a sort of trust but verify way, right?
Uh-huh.
And then companies really needed to work hard as a result of that to give Gen X a reason to believe, right? It wasn't just, I think prior to that, you sort of had, this was really when I think trust in institutions and networks and that sort of thing, the media, people started to really, I think Vietnam and Watergate and stuff like that kicked it off, but I really feel it started to hit its full stride beginning in the 80s, don't you?
Yeah, I think late 80s. We've talked about Operation Desert Storm and the Gulf War. And, I mean, every night it was televised live where, everyone knows obviously the Vietnam War was the first televised war.
Yeah.
But that was coming to us days sometimes after events happened. We were seeing missiles land right there in front of our eyes. So we got to see all of that. And, it's funny that you said, like, companies had to give Gen X a reason to believe. So I was, again, I'm a little older than you, so I was actually working in an agency, a pretty big agency at the time. And I remember that we had these discussions because we knew that authenticity was a thing that we had to deal with, but we were also trying to balance that with how do you make that cool, clever 80s advertising that people will talk about, like entertainment. It still had to be entertaining, but it had to be credible and authentic. So how do you balance that? How did advertisers sell stuff in a way that seemed still eye-catching?
Well, Todd, I'm so happy that you are taking a walk down memory lane, and you chose this particular street to do so. Yes, this alleyway.
Yeah.
Because, how do you sell to people who didn't particularly want to be sold to, right? How do you thread that needle? So let's talk about a few attempts at this, right? Because advertisers and companies, they tried to do this, and there were some mixed results here. So let's talk about a few campaigns.
All right.
So the first one, let's talk about Benetton. Do you remember Benetton?
Yeah.
I mean, it's still around today. It's a global fashion brand that's based in Italy, and it was founded in 1965, and today even it still has a network of about 5,000 stores around the world, and they're here in the U.S. You can find them in larger cities like Washington, D.C., New York, other places like that. They'll have them, but they're not really in not that much is left in a suburban mall anymore in general, but certainly not Benetton. They're sort of in these bigger markets. And the company is known for its sports sponsorships. Also, do you remember Colors Magazine?
I love Colors Magazine.
Yeah.
Tibor Kalman, right?
Yeah. Listeners, look up Tibor Kalman if you don't know who he is, an award-winning designer. He's no longer with us, but he was really radical in his time in terms of changing what you could do with design and what you could do with corporate materials. And then the third thing Benetton was known for was its United Colors. That was sort of the umbrella term for its advertising campaign. So do you remember anything about this campaign, Todd? Do you remember United Colors of Benetton?
Yes. It was addressing kind of worldwide issues. It was controversial. I remember, specifics, you probably will know these more than I do. There was one about an AIDS patient that was dying.
We'll talk about that.
Multiracial, like people kissing, which was a little bit controversial then. But, the big thing was, like adults, they were saying, why the hell is a sweater advertising like this? What the hell does this have to do with it? And I think that's a legitimate question, right?
Absolutely. So let's talk a little bit about some of these ads. You touched on them, some of the more memorable ads, but also the people behind it, right? How did we get here? In 1982, Benetton hired this guy named Oliviero Toscani. Todd, you're more into Italian than I am. Is that
Oliviero
Toscani.
Yeah.
And he was their creative director. Todd, I imagined you on a gondola when you were saying that.
Yeah, that's
going under a bridge.
Eating a pizza.
Wow. You're talented, because that means you have one pizza holding arm, and then you're piloting the gondola, which takes I guess, do you have one of those harmonica holders, and is it kind of like a flatbread pizza, and you just kind of eat it as you're
okay. It's a pizza holder.
Okay. Wow. We might have just invented something new here. Yeah, sorry.
Back to
that
Mr.
also has
Toscani.
nothing to do with selling clothes.
Nailed that.
Yeah. So Oliviero Toscani, he's their creative director. He gets hired as their creative director. And that led to a change in their advertising focus toward raising awareness for various issues worldwide, right?
Yeah.
So I think they thought, we're this global brand. They saw themselves as this global citizen. They have this huge media buy, right? So they have this platform as a result. And so they wanted to sort of exploit that. And I think, in the Oscar Wilde sense, the only thing worse than being talked about is not being talked about, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, in 1984, Toscani photographed the first multiracial ad for the brand, and there were many more that followed. So it sounds crazy to think about that as we're sitting here today, 40 years later?
Yeah.
But yeah, like, you didn't have people of different races appearing in print ads together for some reason.
Yeah.
But again, if you're a global company, why wouldn't you do that, right?
Right, of course.
So a little bit later in 1989, Toscani refocused their advertising strategy under this United Colors of Benetton. So this is how we got to the main meat of this campaign. And the campaign had these graphic billboard-size ads depicting a variety of shocking subjects. They also had spreads in magazines. So basically, you would really start to see these ads all over the place. The first one I want to talk about is the one that included the deathbed scene of an AIDS patient, this fellow named David Kirby, who was actually an AIDS activist.
Oh, right.
And he was dying from the disease. Do you remember this ad?
Yeah,
Do you remember his
it
family
vividly,
and his father over and weeping?
Yeah, I remember vividly.
So originally, if I remember correctly, that photo was actually shot in black and white, and it was later sort of hand tinted. Maybe I don't know if that was digital, but probably in 1989, I imagine
it's probably
they were painting
oils.
on it. Yeah. And then, but one of the most profound things about the ad was that this guy, he looked like Jesus. I mean, he
did, yeah.
At the risk of sounding maybe a little bit sacrilegious here, I mean, he looked like Jesus on the cross. I mean, he just had this very vacant, faraway look on his face. This was in a hospital room. He was in the bed. He was bedridden. His father was weeping over him, and the rest of his family was sort of to the right in the background. I mean, this was when you're flipping through whatever, a typical magazine like a music magazine or a fashion magazine, and you stumble across this, it's definitely going to have some stopping power.
Yeah, it definitely did. It was beautiful in what it was portraying and sort of the editorialism of what it was telling us about the AIDS crisis.
Right.
And it was humanizing the AIDS crisis. Again, it was just odd that it was a sweater company, and I think that people of the time had a little bit of difficulty getting past that. But if I remember right, Benetton continued to do like really beautiful photographs of sort of things that would tweak the national or the international consciousness a little bit, wouldn't
really the status quo, right? The cultural status quo.
Which was great. I mean, it moved us forward.
Yeah. So let's talk about another one of those ads. So this was later in the same year. So again, this was in 1989. There was another attention-getting ad, and it was a photograph of a torso of a black woman. And I don't want to say African-American because she probably was not American. So I will say, in fact, African. Woman's torso, and it shows her holding a baby that's breastfeeding. But the thing about the baby is it was a white baby that was breastfeeding on her torso, on her bare breasts. And that ended up being their most awarded image in the whole campaign. And as you can imagine, I mean, first of all, what an arresting image.
Right.
By the way, listeners, we will post all of these ads on our episode page, so you'll be able to take a look at what we're talking about. But also, the other thing is, what an interesting metaphor for so much of history and exploitation and caregiving and all of these sorts of things, right?
Yeah.
What was interesting, in my opinion, both the first ad we were talking about with David Kirby and then this breastfeeding ad, is these really, I think what Benetton was able to do was really take advertising and start to push it more toward high art.
Yeah, yeah.
It's having these conversations. And again, going back to our Beats episodes when we talked about Jackson Pollock and we talked about when he appeared in Life magazine, and that brought his abstract paintings into everybody's living rooms in middle America, because he was, Life magazine was the most popular magazine at the time. That's what middle America, that's what everybody read. This is the same sort of thing, because this didn't appear, as we mentioned, in only one magazine. It appeared in a bunch of different magazines. So a lot of mainstream culture-based, news-based sorts of magazines. So it was really, really interesting. And then, as you can imagine, of course, you get all this free publicity because other magazines are rerunning your ads for free when they're running articles about them.
Right. And can I add something to that too? By the
Please.
way, it was, the ads. They didn't say like sweaters 20% off or anything like that. They were very copy light. It just had the brand name. And this was at a time, obviously, when advertising was more conceptually driven.
Yes.
That's what people were responding to, and I would say traditional advertising as well as this, which was really kind of, tweaking the social norms. But they were so wonderfully done that, as you just said about the previous ad, you could read so many things into it. If you happen to be upset by things like that, you are going to be more upset. If you happen to find beauty in that, you would enjoy that a lot more. So these ads were simple, they were powerful, and I think they ushered in a lot more of kind of social consciousness in the 2000s as we went on.
Yeah, I'll agree with that. Yeah, the ads were able to thread the needle, I think, intellectually, like you just said, by sort of meeting you where you were.
Yeah. Let me ask you a question.
Sure.
Did they get a ton of complaints, or did they ever have any ads that got complaints?
Okay, Todd. So let's stick with babies for a second, because I want to bring up a third ad that I think is going to answer your question for you.
Okay.
There was a third ad that featured a bloody, unwashed newborn baby. And it still had the umbilical cord attached.
Okay.
So, people
Fresh.
are holding this. Yeah. So it's like, it's got that new baby smell, right?
Yeah.
Straight off the assembly line.
That's right.
So this ad prompted about 650 complaints to the British Advertising Standards Authority, which noted in its 1991 annual report that the Benetton baby ad, quote unquote, attracted more complaints than we have ever previously known. I love that, first of all, that the British Advertising Standards Authority had an annual report. And I do love that Benetton was able to winnow its way into their annual report. That's pretty good.
Yeah, that is.
And then just to wrap this up, a fourth ad, you mentioned kissing earlier. Another ad that got a lot of buzz showed a priest and a nun, and they were sharing a not-so-platonic kiss.
Right. I remember that one as well.
Yeah. It's sort of the nurse and sailor in Times Square a little bit. And it didn't look like that, but it was kind of that sort of idea in a way. It's like, stolen moment. Okay.
Yeah. But you're right. Like all of those that you mentioned, I visually see them in my mind, I could probably sketch out what they look like, without even looking at it. They were so different for the time.
Yeah. And as we've talked about, AIDS, race relations.
Yeah.
Some of the more uncomfortable things about, like, we all come into the world equally, right? Bloody, unwashed.
Right.
And then the idea of, like, these Catholic, or what would you call it, like catechism? I mean, Todd, I'm going to hell, so I don't have these terms at the ready. But anyway, these religious norms are getting broken down.
Yeah.
And then just to wrap up talking about Benetton, in the year 2000, they were included in the reference publication that we all know and love, the Guinness World Records book, for the most controversial campaign. So that was something, I guess. So United Colors ended up being the most controversial campaign.
Well, Good on Benetton, then.
Money well spent.
Yeah, yeah. All right, hey, speaking of something controversial, I was just talking to our bartender.
Oh, to plan the next round of drinks for us?
Oh,
sorry. Is it going to be a surprise? Did I ruin the surprise?
Yeah, you did. You could say that. But I'll tell you what, why don't we take a break and we'll be right back. Hi. We want to take a moment to mention that if you're enjoying this episode, we have an archive of topics ranging from the Olympics to movie posters.
Think Ghostbusters.
Iconic images.
Think Bigfoot.
Punk music.
The Ramones.
Saturday morning cartoons.
The Pink Panther.
And failed products like OK Soda. Visit our website at twodesignerswalkintoabar.com for full episode notes and visuals, the latest blog content, and to sign up for our newsletter.
Follow us on social media. We can be found on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, and YouTube. Find the links on our website or search using the phrase Two Designers Walk Into a Bar.
Most importantly, leave a review on Apple Podcasts. It helps more people like you find podcasts like this.
And tell a friend about us. Send them a link to our podcast from your listening platform of choice.
And if you're inclined, buy our merchandise. Stickers, coasters, magnets, t-shirts. We're designers. We make good stuff, and it helps support the show.
Get in touch. Use the contact form on our website or send an email to hello@twodesignerswalkintoabar.com.
We read every message we get. Honest.
And we're available for speaking gigs. Email us to learn more.
Okay, now, back to the bar. All righty. Hey, welcome back, everybody, and glad we had a little bit of a break. For those of you wondering, yes, Elliot did con me out of another drink during the break, so we both should be good to go for the next little bit, and hope you are too. Right, Elliot?
Absolutely. You know, when the bartender said, fine, 2 bloody babies for you guys, I was worried for a second, but
yeah.
then turns out it was Bloody Marys, and I had misheard it.
Okay.
Yeah.
You just misheard that then.
Yeah. I really need to get to the ear doctor.
But, you know, you were talking about, during the first part of the episode, you were talking about the United Colors of Benetton advertising. And to kind of call back to what started that part of the conversation was, how do you sell without selling out? How did brands be authentic to attract the Gen Xers, but, you know, still achieve their goals and their revenue targets?
You mean, unlike Benetton, they weren't just spending money to spend money and hope for the best?
I sure hope Benetton did achieve some revenue. I hope it sold some sweaters.
Well, there's still 5,000 stores, so they must have done something right.
I hope they sold some color blocking sweaters from the late 80s.
Sweaters that hide stains, that sort of thing.
Yeah. Okay. I hope so.
We need to hunt down a couple of those, given we sometimes wear our drinks as much as ingest them.
That's right. Yes, right. We need like sour mix colored apparel, don't we?
We need Benetton lobster bibs.
Yeah, there you go. That's a good one. I thought of another campaign.
Oh, okay. Hit me. I want to hear this one.
Okay. Have you ever heard of a little store called the Gap? Gap, I think is how it's pronounced. GAP, Gap. Yeah.
There's like a couple stores maybe on the West Coast in the Bay Area.
Yeah. So they started in 1969, and you're right, in San Francisco, just one little store. They started by selling like third-party brands, and then like 5 years later, they started selling their own merchandise, and of course, that's what they are known for now. They still sell quite a lot of clothing now. Most recently, the sales were up to about $3.8 billion in net sales. But That sounds like a lot, doesn't it? Sounds like a lot. Sounds like your bar tab.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't mind having $3.8 billion lying around.
But that's way down from their peak in the 90s, the late 90s, their peak of $11.9 billion. So, you kind of got to ask yourself, oh, what did the Gap do that was so great back then? And I mean, I think people are familiar with one of their earlier campaigns, Fall Into the Gap. They were still kind of known as a jean company.
Yeah.
They really kind of hit on something in the late 80s with this campaign called Individuals of Style. But the one I wanted to talk about is sort of the generation after that came 5 years later. It was their khaki campaign. Because, Elliot, if I've heard you say this once, I've heard you say it 1,000 times. Jeans are sexy, but khakis are boring. So what we had to do is we had to create a Gap campaign for khakis. And if you remember, this was called Blank Wore Khakis. Like, if this featured some of the folks that we've talked about on our episodes, Jack Kerouac, Allen Ginsberg, Miles Davis. And these used not original photography. They used retro stock photography that the people could attain, and they didn't have to pay the current celebrity to model for them. They just paid their estates in most cases.
Yeah, I mean, Ginsberg was still alive. Miles Davis had recently passed away. Kerouac was long. So, you said stock photography, I mean, retro. So it was really more contemporaneous photography, right? It was in other words, these folks, there were these black and white photos, right? And there was these people genuinely wearing khakis. It's not like they stuck their head on someone else's body or something.
Right. They weren't wearing Gap khakis, probably, but it didn't
highly
matter.
Unlikely. Yeah.
But they were still wearing khakis. That's all the ad said was, James Dean wore khakis, Marilyn Monroe wore khakis. And it named, as I said, some of the folks that you and I admire from our past episodes.
Yep.
We've talked about Marilyn, Kerouac, Ginsberg, Miles, Andy Warhol, and then other luminaries like Ernest Hemingway, Pablo Picasso, and Salvador Dali, among others.
Wasn't the Hemingway ad, Hemingway's cats with extra toes peed on his khakis?
I didn't know that. Really?
No, I'm teasing you.
Oh, okay. I was like, wow, there's a little tidbit that I didn't know anything about. Well, now it's real. It's
we'll
been
have
put
to
in the media,
we'll
so
mock
it's
that
real.
up, right?
Yeah, right.
And Hemingway is nowhere in the actual ad. It's just khakis draped over a chair with a cat peeing on them.
Drying from the cat pee.
Yeah, exactly. Scratching.
That's right.
A little bit of an ammonia bouquet. We'll do a scratch and sniff ad.
But as you mentioned, they were historic black and white shots of these cultural icons who happened to be wearing khakis at the time. And some of them go, obviously, back to the 50s and the 60s. And at the time, this campaign launched in 1993. It was Gap's most successful campaign to date. And as I said, if you remember the photographed campaign Individuals of Style, that was shot by Annie Leibovitz, and this was like that sort of natural extension of that. Like, black and white photography was kicking back then.
And just a few years later, so thinking about celebrities and black and white and having all these icons represent a brand, this just makes me think of Apple's Think Different ad when Steve Jobs first came back.
Oh, yeah.
And they didn't have anything that they could really talk about aside from the Apple brand. But there was still some magic left in that brand, and so they pulled together these. It was basically the same thing. It was just footage, black and white footage of Einstein and all these other folks. And I think was Richard Dreyfuss the VO for that? I think
he was. They actually. They originally wanted Steve to do the VO himself, and they recorded a version of that.
Yeah.
That I heard when Lee Clow presented for like the anniversary of the 1984 spot. Anyway, he was talking about Think Different, and Steve Jobs' version's great. He obviously represents. So, but yeah, Richard Dreyfuss was the voiceover, and that was done. Let me see. The Gap campaign was '93. This was maybe what, 4 years later?
Yeah, it was like
Think Different
97,
campaign?
98. Yeah. So there was something in the air during this period, right?
Yeah.
They were really trying to appeal to boomers and Gen X. And again, like we talked about earlier, I think that this was really trying to leverage that authenticity, right?
It was. I think, that's what I was thinking about with this just now, because of the black and white advertising, the black and white photographs, and both of those, and there were plenty others that used black and white. I think that looked more authentic. It didn't feel commercial. And I think that that's what they were trying to leverage. And again, similar to what you said about Benetton, they were leveraging concept, like the concept of James Dean or the concept of Albert Einstein. They weren't
Sure.
they weren't sticking like, Apple Macs, $12.99, stickers on there. But the interesting thing about the Gap Who Wore Khakis campaign is it actually started as a joke.
Oh, really? Okay, I love this.
It started. Yeah, it started around that time as the Individuals of Style campaign was running, which ran for years and years.
Mm-hmm.
And the then art director of the Gap said, because by the way, let's just say, the Individuals of Style, they were celebrity people. They were custom photographed by Annie Leibovitz, as I said, but they were wearing some of their own clothes and then some Gap clothes like black turtlenecks and things like that. So at the time, the then art director off the cuff said they had found a picture of JFK walking on the beach with rolled up khakis and said, Kennedy wore khakis too, thinking like we could use that for something, and didn't realize that there you go, there was a launch of a new campaign.
Wow, that's incredible. I never knew that.
Yeah. I didn't realize that's where it started, and I don't know actually if they ever used the Kennedy image in the khaki campaign.
I don't remember that. I mean, I remember Kerouac, and I remember James Dean, and I remember several of these folks, but yeah, Kennedy, I don't remember.
Yeah.
Boy, how would you? I just think about what was the age? Do you know the agency? Who the agency was? Who?
It was done in house.
Oh wow! Could you imagine being the research assistant that had to pour over all of these photos?
They were calling up
I guess you're thinking who is cool? Like who embodies cool? James Dean embodies cool. Okay, so let's contact James Dean's estate look at movie studio publicity shots
you have to. So I had to deal with something pretty similar about the same time. I was licensing celebrity photos, and being a young art director, I didn't realize that it wasn't just the cost of getting the photo from Getty Images. You have to pay the estate for their image.
Yeah.
So I got to talk to Marilyn Monroe's estate and Lucille Ball's estate, and all three members of the Three Stooges estate. And that time it was affordable. But yeah, you know what I think they did? Is they had a photo researcher to say, like, hey, look for photos with khakis, and then we'll winnow those down to the cool people. But and they got some good ones. But there were some people that called bullshit on the campaign because they had some that were a little bit of really. For instance, did you know Zsa Zsa Gabor wore khakis?
I love that.
Or Leonard Bernstein.
Okay.
Did you know Leonard Bernstein wore khakis?
I never saw the recent movie with Bradley Cooper. Is he wearing khakis in that?
I don't think he's wearing khakis in that. So some people were like, I think that might be a little too far. But a funny story. I know you'll love this because in the previous episode, we were talking about Grand Royal Magazine.
Yeah, the Beastie Boys magazine. Yeah.
In Grand Royal Magazine #1, the very first issue.
Is that the one where Superman first appears?
I don't think Superman appears in Grand Royal, but but it had a equally interesting story. A writer, Hugh Gallagher, who theorized about Gap's motives, and I have a quote from Mr. Gallagher.
Oh, yeah. Hit me with this. Yeah.
Here you go. If you control the way a person dresses, you control their minds. Radical clothes go hand in hand with radical thought, and thus, the Gap. Gap clothes have almost no style, basic colors, conservatively cut pants, sappy sweaters, soul-absorbing basic white T-shirts, and maybe, if you're lucky, a horizontal stripe or two. These clothes promote a straight, white, lame lifestyle, which is just how they want us to be.
Wow. Okay.
I know.
What I really
Grand
like
Royal.
about this, so I will freely admit, this is great because I love the Beastie Boys. I grew up skateboarding, all this stuff. You mentioned a Walkman earlier. I had License to Ill waiting for the school bus in like 7th grade or whatever, and 8th grade, and I would listen to License to Ill on my Walkman. Now, the one thing that I'm not saying this guy's wrong. It sounds a little bit conspiratorial, but also we would buy. There'd be like one or two Gap things that would be like really, really cool, and almost in a way like streetwearish, sort of like unknowingly.
Right.
And then like we would combine that with like stuff we got at a thrift store or whatever. So it was really interesting. Like the Gap could, maybe it was subversive. I never really thought about this till just now, but maybe it was like you buy stuff at the Gap because it was mainstream, but then you coupled it with this other stuff, and then it ended up being far more like to me, like that quote is J. Crew. That quote isn't the Gap. That quote is for J. Like the Gap was preppy, but it was approachable preppy. J. Crew was asshole preppy.
Well, but think about it. They were using pictures of Miles Davis to sell pants, and people felt strongly about these iconic celebrities, and
because these folks are dead and someone else is selling them out, right?
Right. And it was kind of catching a life of its own. The ads became sort of mainstream, and you could start to see references in the comic Doonesbury. Do you remember Doonesbury?
Yeah, of course I remember.
I haven't thought about Doonesbury in a long time. And of course, New Yorker cartoons, which are always on the edge of spearing somebody. And it kind of made. If you were bent that way, you thought Gap was cooler. If you were a skateboarder that you were buying baggy khakis that were going to be torn up on in the pavement, then you kind of thought, okay, well, I'm doing it to the man. But I think we could say probably the height of pop culture kingdom is there was a reference made on the David Letterman show.
Your old buddy.
My old buddy. Like anything that hits Letterman, you got to just give it the chef's kiss. And so listeners will remember, if you were around at that time, that he mercilessly poked fun at then New York Governor George Pataki's name with the Indiana accent, George Pataki, all the time. And so in one of his bits, he introduced Pataki to read the top 10 ways to mispronounce his name, and one of the top 10 ways was Gap khakis.
Okay, so wait, George Pataki read, or Pataki, or however you'd say this.
Yeah.
I don't even know anymore. He read his own top 10 list, and he said Gap khakis
as a mispronouncement of George Pataki as Gap khakis. Yeah.
He's not
so you
too
made
far
it.
off.
You made it.
Yeah, and multiple levels. Yeah.
Yeah. So, that really reached the pinnacle of what you can do with some old stock photos, and then tint them and put a clever headline on it.
Yeah, and again, just like these Benetton ads, it's hard to remember this now, but at the time, this was, and we'll talk about this in an upcoming episode, but this was like sort of the era of peak magazines, right?
Yeah,
magazines were everywhere, and they had a ton of advertising pages in them.
Yeah.
And so I remember seeing these ads. Again, you would see them in fashion magazines. You might see them in news magazines like Newsweek or Time.
Yeah.
You would see them
Rolling
in
Stone.
Music magazines. They were just really, it was just even though there were so many magazines, Details. You remember Details, Todd?
Oh, yeah. Of course.
So it was, even though there were a ton of magazines, it was still much more of a monoculture.
Yeah. So I'm struck because the Benetton ads were, they kind of really traded in controversy. The Gap ads had a little blip of controversy just because, people were calling bullshit that Zsa Zsa Gabor wore khakis, but nothing compared to that. So it's funny that those are really different. Any other campaigns come to mind?
Before we jump into our last example, I just want to say it figures you would unearth some sort of scandal in something as innocent as selling khakis. I love it.
My listeners want to know.
They do.
I know you
get buried in thousands of emails, and they all say, Todd, where's the next scandal?
They're like, tell me the real story, Todd. And I'm like, I've got you.
The story behind the story.
That's right. You can't just start shilling khakis and not think you're going to get away with it.
All right. So speaking of pants, let's stick with pants. We've done a lot.
Okay. All right.
It's really funny now that I'm thinking about this. All of the ones, I guess clothes were huge in the 90s, like in the 80s and in the 90s, or at least advertising for clothes was.
Yeah.
So the third example I have, Todd, you might remember this company. I think it's still around today. Diesel Jeans and Workwear. Do you remember Diesel Jeans?
Yeah. Anna Nicole Smith. Yeah. Yeah, she was a model for them.
I thought she was a model for Guess.
Oh, okay. Well, we can edit that out.
Okay. I'm going to paint a picture here for you a little bit, okay? So We've talked about two campaigns. Let me tell you about some of the arresting images in what Diesel Jeans campaigns were all about. Okay.
All right.
Two male sailors are locked in a kiss as their shipmates celebrate the end of World War II. Okay.
A little takeoff on the Times Square thing, right?
Yeah, potentially. Yeah. Okay. A young guy points a gun while text instructs parents on the importance of teaching kids to kill.
Ugh. Okay.
Yikes, right?
Yeah, right.
And then a black man dives into a whites-only pool in apartheid-divided South Africa. Yeah.
So were these set up photos or were they legit of the time photos?
These were set up.
Okay.
These were art directive. Okay. So all of these scenes were all in the 90s campaigns of the denim brand Diesel, which over the course of the decade created a bunch of different ads that, again, just like Benetton, attacked religion, sexuality, and race head on, right?
Wow.
All of these social issues.
Yeah. Do you think, it kind of seems like they were a competitor of Benetton, so they were having to trade in sort of the same vocabulary, if you will. It sounds like they may even be a little bit more extreme in what they were doing, but where did all this start? Where did it come from?
Todd, we've never done a 23andMe, but I think if we did, I think we would find that you're firmly split, half Canadian and half Italian. You look like, well, maybe you look Canadian. I don't think you look particularly Italian, but I know you love Italy almost as much as you love Canada. And Diesel Jeans was started in Italy in 1978 by a guy named Renzo Rosso. So not Ratso, Ratso Rizzo.
Renzo Rosso.
Yeah, Renzo Rosso, who had been interested in jeans since his mid-20s. So there's something in the water in Italy during this time, right? We had talked about the Italian art director at Benetton. Then now we have Diesel Jeans started by another Italian guy. And so a great quote from him was that he, quote, learned marketing from the U.S., creativity from Italy, and systems from Germany.
Wow.
Unquote.
He's like robo-creative, isn't he?
He is.
Go, Renzo.
Cyborg creative, yeah. So of those areas of expertise, Todd, how about we focus on marketing and creativity and leave the German systems to someone else's podcast to talk about?
That'd be good.
Our sister podcast all about German systems that we have two listeners, neither of whom are in Germany. Okay, so this ad campaign that I mentioned earlier was launched in 1991. And get this, Diesel Jeans had never done any sort of formal marketing before that. So this is how they came out of the gate. guns blazing, right? And again, I think going back to what we were saying earlier, I think Benetton had kind of shown them the way a little bit. I'm not sure they would acknowledge that necessarily, but I think it's hard to deny. Can we agree on that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Plausible.
So the goal was to draw attention not from Benetton, actually, but away from Levi's. So what they saw is their rival jean company, which according to, and I'm going to butcher this name, Jacques Jonasson, commandeered about 75% of the jeans market in Europe at the time. And I know what you're thinking, Todd. Who was Jacques Jonasson?
Yeah, I was just thinking that.
I mean, it's a guy with a cool name. What more do you need to know?
Yeah.
He's Swedish.
He could have been.
He was with an advertising agency. So just like our favorite type of furniture from Sweden, we're going to have to put this name together a little bit ourselves, okay? So I'll spell it, and then I'll butcher the pronunciation, and we can move on.
Okay.
So the agency name is spelled Paradisset. So I'm going to call it Paradisset. How about that?
Okay.
And then we'll never say that again. We'll just say the Swedish advertising agency.
Okay.
So Jacques Jonasson worked for Agency X, and he worked with a former marketing director and fellow Swede named Johan Lindeberg on the images. And together, the two of them, again, in the spirit of Benetton, confronted the kinds of topics that companies today stay as far away from as possible, right? Unless they slip and fall in it, and then everybody pounces.
Right.
And it's kind of fascinating to think about this, right? And maybe this, I don't want to get too philosophical or esoteric or off topic here, but do you think that with the advent of social media and trolls and everything like that, that's just made people much, much more risk averse with all these things we're talking about?
I don't know that it was actually social media as much as it was being afraid of being sued and all sorts of controversy around that, because certainly anybody can be accused of anything now without. So yeah, I don't know, but maybe it was because of advertising like this that we sort of sensitized the public to it.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, who knows?
I don't know.
So anyway, in the spirit of Benetton, they confronted the kinds of topics that companies today stay as far away from, right?
Yep.
And so they created these campaigns which, while controversial, demonstrated that that serious subject matter could be tackled in sort of a tongue-in-cheek way, right? In the case of the two sailors, that was literally tongue-in-cheek.
Hey-o.
Hey! Try the watered-down water. Or Absolute Vodka in the spirit of Sweden.
That's
and
right.
A past podcast
That's
episode. So we have the sailors, we have the kid with the gun, we have the black swimmer, and the visuals were all coupled with the tagline for successful living. Do you remember this irony-laden phrase? Like it was so great because it was so, in a way, so European, right? It was like, oh, that's English. Let's, English language, whatever. Let's sort of slap it on this and see what happens. And the ads, again, we'll post this on our website. I remember, again, in the 90s, seeing these ads all over the place. And something about them, it was very obvious to me they weren't American. Like, even in my late teens, early 20s, whatever, I knew that they were not from the United States. And there was something that was definitely off with them, and I'm using that term in quotes, right? But I always felt like they were highly polished. The execution of these is very, very highly polished. So the ads, there was something about them that was very unique, and as a result, they were attention-getting, right? And like Benetton, even though it would say for successful living, you have this sort of like Bosch painting of weirdness going on, right? And so it didn't spotlight any sort of products or anything. It was really anti-marketing, right? I think it was almost calling bullshit on all of the traditional marketing stuff by saying we can create something like amazingly goofy.
Right.
And I think the goal was to show a fashion campaign was really a fitting canvas for both poking fun at the establishment and inspiring young generations to interrogate the world around them. Okay, so let's unpack some of these topics.
All right. Like the sailors
kissing. Yeah, don't ask, don't tell, right?
Right.
That was what was going on. Gun control and children, right?
Right.
It's like the last thing you want to do is get guns in the hands of kids.
Right.
And then, of course, racism and segregation with apartheid in Africa,
South
Africa.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the campaign. So what? Again, in addition to the conversations around it, what ended up happening here? The campaign actually won a Grand Prix at the Cannes Lions International Advertising Festival, which for the uninitiated, that's kind of like, I don't know what, Todd, the Oscars?
The Oscars, yeah.
Yeah, it's the
advertising.
world's leading award show for advertising and ad agencies. And so it won that top prize back in 1992.
Right.
So, I mean, they must have done something right. I mean, again, still around today, so I don't think they're doing the same. I actually haven't looked up a diesel ad lately, so I can't. I don't know what they're doing now. Do you have any idea?
I have no idea because I thought they were guests. I thought their model was a guest model. Yeah, I have no idea. But, you know, I imagine in all of these, they set themselves up to a place where they're creating different approaches to advertising, but they have to keep reinventing themselves because it's not like they can go back to the same, racism well over and over again without the public going, okay, you're just kind of pulling our leg on this one now.
Okay, Todd, so as we wrap up here, now that we've talked about these different approaches to advertising, do you think we should hit on whether or not it actually worked?
I don't know. Great idea. Should we head to the mall?
Oof. Can we do that next time? It's I'm looking at my watch here, and it's getting a little bit late.
All right, sure. So we've had a mix of shock value, authenticity, and humor at the bar this go-round, right?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, we've got to get this tab paid.
Here we go.
So what do you plan to do about it?
Well, I was thinking...
Speaking of the mall, I wonder what booze mixes best with a smoothie from Orange Julius. I'm also wondering if DoorDash will deliver one here.
That sounds like a great idea on both of those, and we should do a little experiment with the Orange Julius and tell our listeners. Maybe we can get back to that on our next episode coming up.
Yeah, and I mean, Todd, I really feel like this whole episode was chock full of tips for successful living, don't you?
I could not agree more. Tips for successful living.
All right, folks. We'll see you next time.